네, 그러면 P2P 재단 창립자이시고 블록체인을 기반으로 한 조합주의라는 개념으로 사실은 전 세계적으로 그 유명하신 연자분을 모셨습니다. 미셸 바운스 교수님의 발표를 듣도록 하겠습니다. 국문으로 돼 있어서 제목이 좀 그 이색적으로 들릴 수가 있는데 그 Redistributive Urban Sharing 그리고 Cosmo-local Production Sharing 원래 이렇게 원문이 돼 있었습니다. 예, 그럼 발표 부탁드리겠습니다. 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you for inviting me in Korea. So the kind of basic notion that I use in my work is not really sharing, but the commons. And it might be very difficult to translate in Korean, I'm not sure. It does exist in every language, but it's not always easy to find the right word, because in modern society we've basically occluded the practice and the word. Especially in Europe, where we have a Napoleonic law, the very notion of the commons has actually disappeared from the legal system. But as we know from the works of Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, basically the commons is the oldest human institution that we know, and it's the only one that has a record of preserving natural resources over the long term. In other words, any society that wants to live in harmony with its ecology, with its natural resources, with other beings, needs to seriously consider the commons as a central institution in society, because neither the state nor the market have a record of preserving natural resources. There's actually a very nice book which was published in Korea, but I think Koreans probably don't know it. It's in English. It's called Ecological Revolutions and the Eggshell Religions. It was written by Mark Whittaker, who is an American professor somewhere in a university here. And he looks at how historically, whenever societies and civilizations have overused their resource base, which is basically the case of every civilization and society at some point, the commons make a comeback, usually in the form of a religious reform. It discusses 12th century Japan, 15th century China, and also the change in Europe from the 5th to the 10th century. And he shows how the commons basically restore the ecological balance in those societies. I haven't studied it, but if you're interested, one of the examples that's cited is the Tokugawa period in Japan, where for 3 centuries even the population was stable. So that's really good news that we know that there was a society that was able to live within its boundaries, ecological boundaries, and also that lasted for several centuries. And so basically you should be aware of this kind of pulsation between extractive economies, class-based societies that, because they are in competition with each other, tend to overuse their resource base, and then these kind of comebacks of the commons. And we're just right in a commons period right now. You might also be familiar with the word of Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation, which was a history of capitalism. And he shows within capitalism what he calls the lib-lab movement or the double movement. So basically, he talks about these cycles that are called convergent cycles, about 60 years of economic development with a high growth phase and a low growth phase. In the first phase, when there is a new productive system that comes up, fast growth, good for labor, and usually also good for mutualization and commons practices. But it usually ends up with a supply crisis, so capital is not happy because the profit rate goes down. Think about 1973, 1980 as that shift here in the last cognitive cycle. So then we get a second cycle, the second half of the cycle, and those are usually cycles of demutualization. at 2008 can be considered as the end of that cycle. So we're now really in a rebirth of the commons. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but open source movement is an example. So we have now a massive movement in the world to share code, knowledge, design. It has an exponential growth pattern. I did a study, and this is what you see on the slide, about urban commons as well. So I did a study for the city of Ghent in 2017. And the first thing we did was look at mapping urban commons. So what are urban commons? Just to define it, these are groups of citizens who organize around shared resources. So this is what a commons is, a shared resource. And we counted 50 in 2008 and 500 in 2016. So in other words, almost like a tenfold increase of urban commoning in just one city. I've since seen studies that show this to be true for the Flanders, for Belgium, for the Netherlands, for Italy, for Catalonia. So it's a pretty consistent finding that, at least in European, because it could be in other parts of the world, but I haven't seen the studies, that there is a rebirth of urban commoning. So these are people who, basically because there is market and state failure, start self-organizing provisioning systems. So if you want organic food, you'll find that any city in Europe, and probably also true in Korea, there are now hundreds and hundreds of, for example, how you call it, collective purchasing groups, where consumers get together with a group of farmers and directly buy from the farmers. And of course, you would say this is a market function, it's true, but the ecosystem is a commons. In other words, the ecosystem is governed collectively by the stakeholders in this provisioning system. You'll find that for energy, you'll find that for shared habitat, shared mobility, etc., etc. Quite important, I think, to understand it is that it's also quite a different value system, or I call it a value regime. Basically, the value regime we have today is based on commodities, labor, and products that are scarce, seen as scarce products. So value is realized in the market, is taxed by the state, and then redistributed. So this is, but the idea, the basic idea of our capitalist system is that value is created by the market, right? Anything else is not recognized as being value. The thing is, if you're in a commons, this is not the case. The value of Linux as a use value for the millions of people who use it in the world is based not on market value, it's based on contributions. So in other words, the value regime in a commons is a contributory economy. It's who are the people and what are they contributing to this common resource. What also happens is, of course, that people that are commoning need to make a living. So after a few years, maybe they start volunteering, but after a few years, there is an economy that emerges around those commons. Well, if you think about the Linux economy and the open source economy, it was 1/6 of GDP in 2011. That was the study, so it's probably, the figures are probably from earlier. And it involved 17 million workers. Think about the geolocation economy, which would not exist without the sharing of geolocation data. So the source of the value is the commons, and the economy organizes around the shared resource. What is also true, if you look at the left circle on the slide, is that we see that the overwhelming majority of these open source projects and urban commons actually have organizations. But these organizations are quite different in purpose than classic NGOs. So I call them for benefit associations. So think about the Wikipedia as a commons, an open encyclopedia that can be used by everyone. But its servers and financing is managed by the Wikimedia Foundation. Think about Drupal and the Drupal Association. Think about Linux and the Linux Foundation. And so the same is found in the urban commons. When you scratch a little bit, you see that behind these autonomous citizen groups, there is an organization. And so the way I define it, that maintains and protects the infrastructure of cooperation. So making sure over the long term that people can contribute freely and autonomously to the Wikipedia, for example, is the task of the Wikimedia Foundation. So you might say, and of course this is a bit of an hypothesis, that it also represents a way of dealing with value in a society, so that you have at the core of the value creation, civil society is considered to be productive, because every citizen does something for the common good. There's no human being that doesn't contribute to the common good in some way or another. That we have a market that functions for the commons, that is generative towards the commons, both human commons and natural resources. And that you have a state form that supports the autonomy of these commons. So I call this a partner state. Now I just want to give you, this is not the topic of today, but I'll just mention it briefly. So we have, sorry, this is in Dutch, but it's, I'll explain it. So the best example today of the commonification of societies and the state is what's happening in Italy. So you had a legal reform some years ago that introduced subsidiarity in the Italian constitution. Subsidiarity means the right of citizens to take up the management of resources at the lowest appropriate level. It wasn't used much until the referendum around water privatization, which took place, I think, in the end of the 90s, 1997, 98, when 97% of Italian people rejected the privatization of water. And based on that dynamic, social dynamic, what happened then is that Bologna created the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. So this is a public commons protocol that allows any group of citizens in Italy to say, I want to care for this resource. Think about squares that haven't been maintained by the city, abandoned buildings, abandoned factories, parks. So now there is a legal way in which citizens can say, we want to take care of this, and it's recognized by the city. They then formulate what's called a pact of collaboration, and the governance system is called quintuple helix, which is basically the city, the commercial sector, the non-governmental sector, the research sector, working together in four to support the social innovation through the commons. I heard from one person from Lapsus, which is one of the organizations that is stimulating this, that it already involves 800,000 Italians in common work in their cities. So that's, and more than 200 cities have taken up that, that kind of activity. These kind of regulations now exist in the Netherlands, different other countries with different names, but this is a good example of how institutions adapt to this new wave of commoning and legalize it and regulate it. So I'm going to focus now on the idea that as we are digitizing our economies, we are creating virtual systems of collaboration that influence human choices and behavior. And so basically, if you look at this as a, how do you call it, XY axis, from top to bottom, it's centralized versus distributed. And from left to right, it's for profit versus for benefit. So this gives you 4 quadrants. And I think this pretty much gives you a vision of what is happening today. And those are 4 socio-economic technical systems that compete for hegemony. They all exist. They're all growing very rapidly. And we talked about one of them today, which is what I call netarchical capitalism. You have noticed that Uber doesn't build cars, that Airbnb doesn't build hotels. So in other words, they're quite different from classic capitalist societies. They don't hire labor and get all their value out of labor. What they do is they basically allow exchange and commoning, and then they tax our exchanges and our commoning. So Google and Facebook tax our commoning, our sharing of knowledge and communication, and Uber and Airbnb tax our exchanges. Of course, you could, and I agree with that argument, that some of them are fake, they actually use labor, but a lot of them really do function like that. And so in a way we could say we're moving from a capitalist regime based on, I call it Marxist capitalism. I know that sounds a bit contradictory, but based on extracting surplus value, to a Proudhonian capitalism, which directly exploits human cooperation. So that's what they're doing. They actually, so classic capitalism privatizes and encloses the commons, but these new capital firms, they actually stimulate our commoning, but then they extract value from this activity. The second one is on the bottom left, and this is distributed but also for profit. And so I'm just going to start with an anecdote. I live in Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand, sorry. And it's sometimes considered the capital of nomadic labor, of digital nomadic labor. So we have a Facebook group with 25,000 people on it. And I even went to a conference, which was a bit unbelievable for me, because the speaker said, the problem in Chiang Mai is that we can't find anybody that wants to work for money anymore. And of course, what he meant was that in his ecology, in his ecosystem, there's so many workers through the blockchain economy that have actually succeeded in accumulating some type of wealth, that they basically have a few years of wages prepaid. So this is maybe my first introduction to the blockchain economy. So this basically, this system combines an idea of markets, but every person is a market player, right? It's not based on big corporations. The idea of big corporations, big banks, big governance is based on this idea that we're all playing a game of Monopoly. And so the idea is to create a level playing field where this can happen. The problem, if you like, is that, of course, all these platforms are actually designed from a libertarian point of view. So all the design decisions are based on an understanding of the economy as for Hayek and Friedman. And they're baked in the design of those systems. Think about blockchain, the Bitcoin, for example, where you create a lot of Bitcoin in the beginning, but then you slow down the production of the Bitcoins. That's designed to stimulate demand and constrain supply so that the value can only go up. Yes, of course, it goes up and down as well, but ultimately, it's designed for the value to go up. So this is a typical design principle that is inspired to enhance the market function of those platforms. But I want to be a bit advocate of the devil. They also bring two things. First of all, they're open source. That's very important. So they're open source and they have productive communities. And second, they create collaborative ecosystems. So if you look at any blockchain project, it will be extractive to the outside. And for example, all the problems with the energy that is needed to produce Bitcoin, for example, is a good example. But on the inside, they really function as collaborative ecosystems. So they're like open source in the sense they're designed for people to come in and out as they wish. And you really see the family resemblance with the platform economy, right? Which is based on the same idea. It's just here that they don't want private platforms. They want open platforms. So this is interesting because the ecosystems are in some fundamental way a commons. So this is the second interesting thing about the blockchain economy. The third thing is that their financing system is independent of venture capital and banks. They use them if they want to, they can, but they are basically crowdfunding to the whole population. So in other words, the venture capital and the banks, if they play a role, do not play the dominant role in principle in these ecosystems. So this is also quite interesting. And fourth, they reserve 40% of the tokens for the work. And I don't see any other system which reserves 40% of the income for actually people who do the work. So, if you're a Marxist, you should be happy with that aspect of the blockchain economy because it does create a substantial amount of income for the developer community and all the people that work on these systems. So on the right, you have global commons communities and then the urban commons at the bottom right, but I won't go into it directly, but I want to show you that basically our idea at the P2P Foundation is that design is a choice, right? That there's no such thing as a neutral technology. The way we design technology is already a representation of our interests, our values, a power balance between different groups that use the ecosystem, et cetera, which also means that we could do it differently. So let me quickly go over these ideas. So the first thing is, so in the case of netarchical capitalism, what was called here the sharing or even the anti-sharing economy, the thing we can change here is say, well, okay, we want to do commoning, that's for sure. We want to exchange knowledge, we want to exchange knowledge. We might even want to do transactions like ride sharing amongst ourselves. So idle sourcing, I'm not sure who mentioned that, but idle sourcing is essentially a good thing ecologically speaking, right? For example, if you can reuse rooms with private people, maybe we don't have to build more hotels. That could be, from an ecological point of view, an interesting thing. Ride sharing could be used, to have less single cars driving alone. The important thing, though, is to also realize that the for-profit motivation of Uber, for example, actually sabotages those benefits. So I'll give you an example from, again, Dégage is a non-profit car-sharing association. As you know, cars are only used 5% of the time on average, and it's actually going down, because now people have more cars per family, so they use even less. And so they have 10% of the cars for their community, which is double the amount of what is actually needed. So they have 130 cars for 1,300 people. And if you study those examples, so poly-governed associations or co-ops that work with a for-benefit, purpose-driven, mission-driven orientation, they actually save between 9 and 13 private cars per shared car. So there it's actually working. But in the case of Uber, it's not working because every driver is competing with every other driver. So they have to be in the right place at the right time to get called. So what you see in cities where Uber is active is that even more cars are driving around empty in order to get the job. So it's very important to look at governance and property mechanisms and say, well, why don't we create our own platform? Why don't we have a platform as a commons? Yes, we want to do ride sharing, but why do we give the money to Uber? Why don't we create our own cooperative platform? We tax it a little bit, but then we have a co-op which can reinvest the surplus in the ecosystem. I want to give you an example because I'm doing this, and I forgot your name, but the activist. Where are you? Sorry, I can't find you. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about the issues that you brought, so I'm a member of something called SMART, which in French means Société Mutuelle des Artistes, Mutual Society of Artists, and basically it's a hack on labor. So we talk about autonomous labor. I want to explain you how it works. So we organize freelancers. So when we join SMART, which is a cooperative active in 9 different European countries, we pay 2% of our wage in a mutual guarantee fund. This guarantees that we get paid within 7 days. Now, you might think this is a trifle. It's not. Most freelancers get paid 3 months plus at the earliest. So that's the average in Europe. And most small companies go bankrupt not because they don't have enough clients, but because they don't have cash flow at the right moment. So that's already a big advantage. If by mutualizing the pool is that we can support each other and pay out in advance our invoicing. Then the second thing we do is that SMART will actually take on the invoicing for us, and this is called factoring. It's usually a capitalist practice, but in this case, because it's a co-op, we pay 4.5% for the service, but all that surplus is used to generate the ecosystem for what we need in order to work. So this is the second step. The third step is, after 6 months to 1 year, we'll propose our members to pay their own salary. So what happens here is you have two accounts, the account where you get your money, and then you feed that to another account which gives you a monthly wage. You pay taxes, but you get full social security protection. I think this is a very interesting model that could be applied in other countries, because what we have here is we preserve our autonomy. And I want to say a few things. Yes, there are fake freelancers, like the ones you mentioned, but there are also people in the arts, in IT, that want to be that. 80% of our members say they want to be like that. In other words, they want their freedom to work on projects, to change projects. They want this flexibility. Yes, they work hard. It's not like they can take 4 months off. But these people want, basically, they have some vision of their craft, and so they want to work this way. And the solution that SMART offers is that you preserve your freedom, but you actually have a salary and you're a worker. And your boss is yourself, because you're in a co-op. So I'm just suggesting that this is an interesting model. And this is typically what we call a platform cooperative. So these are now emerging in many different fields. In the US, you might know that actually the unions are now financing platform co-ops for nurses, for domestic work. And again, the big advantage is that they have the minimum wage and they reinvest the surplus in their own ecosystem. So then I want to talk a little bit about ledger co-ops. And this is basically the topic of the day. So what I'm suggesting is that we can rethink the blockchain ecosystem from a point of view of social equity and ecological harmony. In other words, every principle that is behind the current blockchain can be rethought. So I'll give you a few examples. What about the currencies? Well, all the currencies, nearly all the currencies, are commodity currencies. Their value is driven by supply and demand, as Bitcoin is, for example, right? So it's used as a speculative currency. It's like a gold that people use in Venezuela and countries where they have a crisis. People buy Bitcoin in order to preserve their wealth. But it doesn't tell you anything about the real world. So it's like our national money. The money doesn't tell us what's happening in our ecology. And so we can change that. For example, we can mutual credit currencies, which are based on exchanging labor. We can have asset-based currencies, which are based on an ecological resource. I'll give you two examples. Solar coin is created by renewable energy. So we know we can spend it because the energy for that activity has been created. So we're not overusing our ecosystem in this case, because the money itself gives you, it's intelligent crypto, which gives you an information about the ecosystem in which it operates. And another example is the fish coin, which is designed for the fishing industry, which integrates the the reproduction of the fish. So you can only buy so much fish as there is fish that can be fished without destroying their self-reproduction. So you can see how we can redesign the idea of a cryptocurrency and still, but have it with a different logic. Let me tell you another example. So smart contracts is the idea that we can automate some of our exchanges, right? So the idea is that if we do something a lot of times, I pay you X so that you do Y for me, that we just automate it on the blockchain. The vision, if you look at the governance systems around the blockchain, they're all based on individual choice. So in other words, it's called individual methodological individualism. It's a market thinking. So there's so it basically is using incentives to make all the stakeholders move in a convergent way. But that's not what normal people think when you think governance, right? So for example, we could have collective contracts. So somebody called this Ostrom contracts. You keep the idea of smart contracts, but you can make collective agreements as well. Okay, all the proofs of consensus, the things that validate a transaction on the blockchain are oligarchic proofs. So basically, the more you give, the more you get. So basically, an oligarchic proof is a proof that creates an oligarchy. So you should think of the blockchain as it exists today as a game of Monopoly. We all start equal, but every iteration of the game of a competition for scarce good means that in the second round somebody is stronger than somebody else, and so the game gets rigged more and more towards oligarchy. So I think about 12 people actually own, is it 90% of the bitcoins, and they've shown that they actually a huge amount of transactions are fake because they basically sell to each other. So that gives an impression of, of a lively market. So anyway, so I just want to say we can also make anti-oligarchic proofs. Every society that has maintained distribution of income within a certain level uses anti-oligarchic measures. Think about progressive taxation. That's just an example of an anti-oligarchic protocol. I'll give you an example from the music industry. This is called Jamendo. It's an open source music site. So every download is a vote, but for the first 10,000 songs, one download is one vote. Then it's for the next 100,000, you need 2 downloads for 1 vote, and then 3. And the surplus is redistributed so that unknown music can be shown instead of what we now have with Amazon and everything, is this winner-take-all systems where only the big ones get the attention. Okay, I'm not going to go through all these examples, but you can see that it's a way of thinking about using ledgers for good, for having social ecological purposes. Now, I want to say one thing about why this is such a radical evolution. Accounting is really the way we see the world, right? The first writing was a ledger from Mesopotamia, where some temple described what comes in and what goes out in terms of grain. And this is basically the state. As we invented the state, we invented accounting. Then in the 15th century, a Franciscan monk, Lucio Pacio, or Lucio Paci, I forgot how exactly to pronounce his name, synthesized double entry book accounting, which is capitalism and is narcissic accounting. What comes in my collective entity, what goes out, and how much do I keep as a surplus. So in other words, classic accounting doesn't give you any information about the real world. It just gives you financial information. So the fact that we now have a public, open, distributed ledger. And so here I want to give you 3 examples of new forms of accounting which are emerging in these ecosystems. So I did a report last summer. It's called P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival. And if I have 5 minutes, you should tell me, because I can talk quite a bit. 4 minutes. Okay, so I'll finish with this. So we now have ecosystems using blockchain or similar distributed ledger technology that has invented 3 forms of post-capitalist accounting. The first one is called contributive accounting. So think about you're in an open source community and you're dependent on contributions. Only some of these contributions are recognized by the market. So what do? Well, what you do is very simple. You create a membrane around your community and you redistribute the income from the outside according to your own value system. So we call this value sovereignty. And basically, common systems are pluralistic value systems. They recognize not just market value, but basically any value that the community wants to recognize. So this is one example. So this is called contributive accounting. I have about 400 examples of it in my wiki. The second is called flow accounting. It's called resources, events, agents. Very simple. I'll give you an example. So we are two agents. You're the resource. So I'm going to sell the resource to you. And that's the event, right? So flow accounting is remarkable because it doesn't have double entry. And it's also remarkable because it's an ecological accounting. Every transaction represents a 3D vision of where you are in the ecosystem. And this is what we need. We need to know what we are doing in the world. Okay, then the third type of accounting is called thermodynamic accounting. Basically, it's directly looking at matter and energy, real flows, real-time flows, and how much we can use in terms of planetary boundaries. So all these tools exist. What we need is a vision to bind them together. And I'll give you, and I'll conclude with my vision on this. Some of you might recall there was a big debate in the 1930s called the socialist calculation debate. On the one hand, we had some leftists like Karl Polanyi. And on the other hand, we had Hayek. And they won the debate because the debate was around planning versus market pricing. So here's what I think we can actually converge this debate in a synthesis, right? So the first layer of this new global accounting system, a shared logistics and shared ledgers, is mutual coordination. The commons is based on mutual coordination. Think about open source. So it's like in a football game. You have two teams. Every player in the team can see the game in real time and can adjust his relationships. So if you're a Linux developer, everything is holoptical. So every player in the game can see the whole system. So every open source developer can see what needs to be done in the system. It's visible. It doesn't need a command in order to actually work on a particular problem. So this is the first layer. Basically human labor and you know, free to give energy or paid energy. The second level is regenerative market transactions. So everywhere we need reciprocity, we can design market functions that are embedded in social needs. So I mentioned Fishcoin, Solarcoin as examples of how we can create market functions that work for communities and natural resources. And the third level is the coercive level, is the planning level. So how does that work? We would have a global thresholds and allocations council. This is being done by a group called Reporting 3.0. And so they basically keep tables of copper, oil, anything, how much copper there is in the world, how much do we expect to find on average, what's the biocircularity, and this gives a global vision of what's available for humanity without destroying the planet. And this goes down to local, regional accounting systems. These things all exist, so you should maybe read the report. But you see that we can actually have a system which marries free mutual coordination, the big dream of the left in the 19th century, generative markets, which work for society and for nature, and actually planning, central planning, not as a here's what you should do, but it gives you a scope of freedom in which humanity can make choices. I want to say one more thing, just 1 minute. So here's the problem. People, citizens, are actually solving ecological issues as we speak, but they're poor, precarious, and not recognized. And this is because as long as we recognize only market value and tax market value, what we're recognizing and simulating is extractive practice. And people who do generative practice, what they're really doing is taking up costs on themselves and making themselves more expensive in the market. So this is an issue. So just an example. What if we instituted public distributed ledgers where the government, the city, says we need to decarbonize. Instead of doing competitive procurement, we will allow every citizen, every company, every cooperative to declare their decarbonization, have it verified, and have it tokenized. And then we look for the income side. Institutions that benefit from this positive ecological externality. Or the government which thinks it has value to save human society, and so it wants to invest in decarbonization. In this way, we can actually mobilize whole populations to do the vital generative ecological work that we need to do. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다.